Hello everybody, my name is Stefan Lange. I am a physicist working at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and today I want to give you a brief introduction to the topic of bias correction with quantile mapping. To begin with, let us take a look at the modeling chain as we typically have it in climate change impact assessments. We usually start with the output of a climate model that was used to project how the climate changes under certain future greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And then what we usually want to do is we want to use the output of that climate model as the input of an impact model, such as a hydrological model, in order to simulate how the projected climate change impacts other parts of the Earth system. Now, unfortunately, usually the climate model output cannot be directly used as input to the impact model because there are biases in that output, and that is why, as an intermediate step, we need to do a bias correction of the climate model output. To be a bit more specific, what we need for hydrological modeling are climate input data for different variables, including precipitation, radiation, wind speed, humidity, and temperature. Now, often when we look at time series of these variables and compare historical observations to historical simulations, we find systematic differences between them simply because the climate models are not perfect. As an example, you see here two temperature time series where the blue line represents observed temperatures and the orange line represents the corresponding simulated temperatures. If we look at the distributions of the values in the time series, as represented by the histograms shown in the right panel, we find that those distributions hardly overlap and that the mean of the simulated values is significantly greater than the mean of the observed values. Such a systematic difference between simulated and observed climate is what we call a bias. Now, what would happen if we did climate impact modeling with such biased climate input data? In the present example, the mean value bias is rather small, with a magnitude of only about 2 degrees Celsius, but since the distributions of the temperatures around those mean values are pretty narrow, most of the simulated values are above zero, whereas most of the observed values are below zero. Which means that if we took those time series as input to a hydrological model, if the model was driven with the observed temperatures, then the model would simulate winter-like conditions with frozen soil and a stable snowpack, whereas if driven with the simulated temperatures, the condition would be more like in the melting season. So it is natural to ask if there is a way to correct for the bias in the simulated data to the end of making the simulated hydrology more realistic. This is exactly the goal of bias correction. Nowadays, the most popular method used for bias correction is the so-called quantile mapping method. The idea of quantile mapping is to change the values in a time series such that after the mapping the distribution of values is equal to, or at least very similar to, that of the observed values, but to leave all other characteristics of the time series as pristine as possible. The most simple form of quantile mapping assumes that the simulated and observed time series are of equal length and just maps the lowest value in the simulated time series to the lowest observed value, the second lowest simulated value to the second lowest observed value, and so on. If we apply this method here to map the values in the simulated time series in orange to those of the observed time series in blue, the result is the corrected time series plotted in green. We see that the distribution of the values in the corrected time series is identical to the distribution of the observed values, while the temporal structure of the corrected time series is identical to that of the simulated time series. As an example, look at the lowest values of the three time series. This value occurs at the same time step in the simulated and corrected time series. The difference is just the value, which for the corrected time series is equal to the lowest value of the observed time series. The reason for why the method is called quantile mapping becomes clearer if we take a look at the empirical cumulative distribution functions of the values in the simulated and observed time series. As I said before, the simplest form of quantile mapping maps the lowest simulated value to the lowest observed value, the second lowest simulated value to the second lowest observed value, and so on. In other words, simulated values are mapped to observed values of the same cumulative probability. So for example, the median of all simulated values is mapped to the median of all observed values, and more generally, every quantile is mapped to the quantile corresponding to the same cumulative probability. That is why the method is called quantile mapping. The task of bias correction becomes more challenging when the climate model output we wish to correct represents climate conditions that we have no observations for. The most prominent example for this case is the bias correction of future projections of climate change, where we typically have historical observations, a climate model simulation representing historical climate conditions, and a climate model simulation representing future climate conditions under some greenhouse gas emissions scenario. Since we do not have observations of these future climate conditions, we do not know the biases of the climate model under those conditions. All we know are the biases under historical climate conditions and how climate conditions will change in the future according to the projection. That means that if we want to bias correct the projection, we have to make an assumption about the change in bias under changing climate conditions. To find out which assumptions are realistic, some researchers have looked into differences between climate projections made with different climate models and how these differences change with climate change. They found that in most cases the differences were relatively stable across different climate conditions, which implies that in most cases it is realistic to assume that climate model biases remain approximately constant under climate change. Now, what does that mean for quantile mapping? Or more precisely, how can we do a quantile mapping of future climate projections under the constant bias assumption? Well, quantile mapping means to correct every quantile of a distribution individually, and the constant bias assumption means that we can assume that all those quantile-specific biases remain unchanged under changing climate conditions. Therefore, we can use the historical simulation and observation to derive quantile-specific biases and then use these to correct the projection. In the present example, we would start with the lowest value of the projected time series and correct it by adding to it the difference between the lowest values of the observed and simulated historical time series. If we continue doing that with the second lowest values of the three time series, the third lowest values, and so on, we will arrive at the time series plotted in green. We can also look at this from the distribution point of view again. Here you see the cumulative distribution functions of the time series from the previous slide, Blue is the historical observation, orange the historical simulation, red is the future projection, and green is the quantile map future projection. To illustrate how quantile mapping worked here, let us look at the correction of the median, which for each of the distributions is now marked with a dot. The correction starts with the median of the projected time series and adds to this the difference between the observed and the simulated medians from the historical period. So the length of the horizontal arrow is equal to the distance between the blue dot and the orange dot. The resulting value is the median of the corrected time series. We can also put this into a formula, as you can see here on the left-hand side, where we have symbolically written that the difference between the corrected and the projected median is equal to the difference between the observed and simulated median in the historical period. Now we can also look at this from a different angle and ask what this kind of quantile mapping does to the climate change signal projected by the climate model. More precisely, we can ask to what extent our quantile mapping has changed the trend projected for every quantile of the temperature distribution. For the median in our example, the projected trend is given by the distance between the red dot and the orange dot. And since a quantile mapping of the historical simulation would result in a temperature distribution that is identical to the observed distribution, the corrected trend, that is the trend in the bias-corrected median, is given by the distance between the green dot and the blue dot. Now it turns out that if we look at the formula on the left-hand side, we can actually rearrange it into the equivalent formula written below. This new formula tells us that the difference between the corrected and observed median is in fact equal to the difference between the projected and simulated median, which means that the corrected trend is equal to the projected trend. Since this holds true for all quantiles, this kind of quantile mapping is also called trend preserving. This has been an introduction to bias correction with one particular kind of quantile mapping. To give you an idea of alternatives and the many options you actually have when you plan to do a bias correction in practice, I would like to conclude this lecture with a brief literature overview. First, I would like to mention that next to the constant bias assumption, some researchers prefer to correct future climate projections under the constant relation assumption. This means that they assume that the same function can be used for quantile mapping under different climate conditions. Such quantile mapping does not preserve trends. For an overview of this topic, I suggest to read the following 4 papers. Secondly, the quantile mapping method I used for this introduction is the most simple form of a non-parametric quantile mapping method. In contrast to these, parametric quantile mapping methods fit parametric distributions to the data and use those for the mapping. This approach promises reduced overfitting and a more robust correction of extreme values, but crucially depends on the goodness of fit. For an overview of these 2 different approaches, I recommend you read the following 3 papers. And finally, the kind of bias correction I introduced you to only adjusts the distribution of all values in a time series for one variable. Such an approach cannot correct natural variability at different timescales, or spatial variability, or statistical dependencies between different variables. For approaches that deal with these aspects of bias correction, I recommend you to take a look at the following 5 papers.